Imagine standing in the heart of an ancient tomb, your flashlight catching the glint of gold from a death mask buried for over 3,000 years. The silence is overwhelming, but beneath that mask lies a secret the ancients never intended to reveal, a secret etched into bone, blood, and DNA. This is not just a tale of lost kings and sun-baked empires. This is a story of how some of the most powerful rulers in human history, the pharaohs of Egypt, slowly and systematically destroyed themselves, not by war, not by famine, but by a belief so sacred, so unshakable, it became fatal. For over 3,000 years, Egypt's royal families chased a single idea: that their blood was divine, that mixing it with common people would defile the gods' will. And so, brothers married sisters, nephews married aunts, fathers wed daughters. The royal line was preserved at the cost of unimaginable suffering. The logic was airtight to them. Pharaohs weren't just kings, they were gods on earth, descended from the sun deity Ra, avatars of Horus. To dilute that blood was to offend the heavens. So the walls of palaces and temples echoed with divine rhetoric, while behind them a genetic time bomb was quietly ticking. At first, the damage was subtle: a crooked spine, an unusual face, children who didn't survive infancy. The priests called these divine signs proof of otherworldly heritage. No one dared whisper the truth: that the bloodline was rotting from the inside. Each generation added another layer of genetic poison. Recessive genes, normally hidden in the shuffle of genetic diversity, began to collide, and each royal birth became a roll of the dice. Would the child walk, speak, live past 10? The irony was brutal. These rulers built wonders that defied time: pyramids, temples, entire cities carved from stone. They mastered astronomy and medicine, but they could not see what was happening to their own children, not because they were ignorant, but because they believed too deeply in a lie. The divine bloodline became a golden cage, trapping generation after generation in bodies that could not carry the weight of godhood. But the damage didn't just stay in the genes, it leaked into their art, their religion, their politics. What began as a sacred tradition became a civilization-wide illusion, one that blinded even the most brilliant minds to the slow unraveling of their legacy. This isn't fiction, it's history, written in bones, confirmed by DNA, and told across thousands of years of tombs, carvings, and mummies. To understand just how far this illusion went, and how devastating the consequences became, we must step into the palace of a boy king who couldn't walk without a cane, a man worshipped as a god whose body was breaking from the inside out. But before we meet him, we need to trace the origin of the curse, back to the first pharaoh who believed that only a sister could carry his bloodline forward. The belief that started it all wasn't born of malice. It was born of power, of fear, and of a desire to cheat the one thing even kings can't conquer: time. Centuries before the boy king would limp through golden halls, Egypt's royal ideology was already setting the trap. Picture the moment. A newly crowned pharaoh stands on the steps of a temple, the sun blazing over the Nile, the people cheering below. He is divine, or so he's been told since birth, a living god, descendant of Ra. But behind him stands his sister, soon to become his wife, not out of love, not by choice, but because the priest said so. It was the beginning of a pattern that would define dynasties. This idea that gods must marry gods was simple, powerful, and catastrophic. The pharaoh's essence, they believed, was so holy that only another of divine birth could carry it forward. And so his sister became queen. Their children were both heirs and products of a dangerously narrowing gene pool. The Egyptian elite weren't fools. They were astronomers, engineers, artists, scribes. They built monuments that still defy comprehension, but their cultural obsession with purity blinded them to something more insidious than any foreign invasion: genetic collapse. Early warning signs appeared, but no one paid attention. A prince with a cleft palate, blessed by the gods, a royal child who died at 5, chosen for the afterlife, a princess unable to bear children, a sacred vessel. Religious interpretation became a filter that turned every tragedy into prophecy. And as more siblings married, the effects compounded. Recessive genetic mutations, usually harmless when diluted in a diverse population, now had nowhere to hide. This wasn't a single generation's mistake, it was a centuries-long spiral, reinforced by tradition, religion, and politics. Over time, Egyptian rulers became walking testaments to their own mythology and to its failure. It's no coincidence that their art began to change. In the earliest dynasties, pharaohs were depicted as towering, muscular warriors, perfect in form, godlike in presence. But as inbreeding progressed, something shifted. Royal statues began showing strange proportions: elongated skulls, narrow torsos, wide hips, drooping faces. At first, scholars thought it was a stylistic evolution, but modern genetics offers another explanation. The art became accurate. These weren't artistic metaphors, they were mirrors. In the New Kingdom, Egypt's golden age, the consequences became unavoidable. One family, in particular, would embody the extremes of this ideology. Their reign would challenge Egypt's gods, change its capital, and document deformity in ways no other dynasty dared. It began with a prince named Amenhotep IV, born into a world that demanded he be perfect. But when his reflection revealed a warped image, he didn't look away. Instead, he changed the rules of godhood. He would become known as Akhenaten, the heretic king, and his reign would expose the cost of divine blood in full. The year is 1353 BCE. In the scorching heat of Middle Egypt, a boy is born into gold, prophecy, and expectation. His name is Amenhotep IV, but history will remember him as Akhenaten, the pharaoh who defied Egypt's gods and exposed a divine bloodline breaking under its own weight. From the beginning, something is wrong. His skull is unnaturally elongated, his hips are wide, feminine, his chest swells in ways no boys should. As he grows, his body refuses to align with the image of a god-king. Servants avert their eyes. Courtiers speak in reverent whispers, careful not to say what everyone sees. The royal sculptors, once masters of flattery, now face an impossible task. How do you immortalize a god whose body seems broken? But Akhenaten does something no ruler before him dared. He tells them, "Show it all." For the first time in Egyptian history, royal art becomes brutally honest. Statues and frescoes reveal a family that looks almost alien. Sunken eyes, narrow limbs, elongated faces. Akhenaten, his wife Nefertiti, and their daughters are depicted in distorted beauty, their proportions pulled from real life rather than ideal form. Modern scholars once thought this was a religious shift, a symbolic departure from tradition, but the evidence suggests otherwise. This was realism, and behind that realism lay generations of inbreeding. Akhenaten's deformities weren't divine, they were inherited. He was the product of incestuous unions going back centuries, his parents likely full siblings. His children would carry the same legacy. Of his 6 daughters, few survived childhood. Some appear in art with the same warped features. Sons, if born, died in infancy. But it wasn't just genetics weighing on Akhenaten. It was something deeper, desperation. He rejected the old gods, all of them, and elevated a new one, Aten, the sun disk. He declared himself the sole voice of this god, disbanding the priesthoods, abandoning Thebes, and building a new capital in the desert, Akhetaten, modern Amarna. There he ruled in isolation, surrounded by family and loyalists. But was it religious vision, or a frantic attempt to start over? Far from tradition, in the middle of nowhere, Akhenaten ruled over a city of silence. He erased the names of old gods from monuments, filled temples with sunlight, and watched his bloodline shrink with every failed birth. When he died, likely in his 30s, the dynasty was fractured. His revolution collapsed within a generation. The capital was abandoned. His name was erased from history by priests who called him a blasphemer. But his legacy lived on, in the body of his son, Tutankhaten. He would be renamed Tutankhamun, the boy king whose body would carry the final echoes of Egypt's great genetic tragedy. In 1341 BCE, the sun rose over Egypt and illuminated the birth of a child who would become the most famous pharaoh in history. Not because of what he did in life, but because of what his body could no longer hide. His name was Tutankhaten, later changed to Tutankhamun. The son of Akhenaten, likely born from a union between full siblings, the boy entered the world already cursed by his bloodline. He was crowned king at just 9 years old, but from the beginning, his body betrayed the image of divinity that Egyptian kings were meant to project. His left foot was twisted, a club foot so severe he needed walking sticks to move. His spine was curved and unstable, his chest underdeveloped, his immune system fragile. Every step was pain, every breath a quiet battle. He was worshipped as a living god, yet lived in a body too fragile to carry even a mortal's burden. The illusion of power had never been thinner. Palace artists were ordered to depict him as strong, upright, godlike. Yet reality bled through the brushstrokes. His golden throne had to be carefully structured to support his posture. Priests chanted praises to his divine strength, while servants discreetly supported his frame behind ceremonial fans. He married his half-sister, Ankhesenamun, continuing the ancient cycle of inbreeding. Their union produced only heartbreak, miscarriages and stillborn daughters. 2 tiny mummies were buried with the boy king, not heirs, but symbols of a dynasty collapsing from within. Over 130 walking sticks were found in his tomb, not as royal symbols, but daily necessities. Canes, crutches, tools to maintain the illusion of control in a life built around hiding weakness. His every move was a performance for gods who would not answer. In the silence of the palace, Tutankhamun must have known the truth. He had seen the temple walls filled with images of heroic ancestors, but knew he couldn't live up to them. His physicians documented every illness, every infection, every broken bone that refused to heal. But they didn't understand what we now know. This was the unavoidable result of centuries of genetic isolation. At just 19, Tutankhamun contracted malaria. For a healthy body, it might have been survivable. For him, it was fatal. He died in pain and silence, buried in haste, almost forgotten. And yet, his tragedy would echo louder than any other. Over 3,000 years later, his tomb would be discovered, untouched, dazzling and haunting. Gold masked his face, but CT scans and DNA tests would finally uncover the truth. His parents were siblings. His body, a record of genetic collapse. His life, proof that the divine bloodline was anything but holy. But the story didn't end with his death. Centuries later, foreign conquerors would arrive. They would study the same gods, the same temples, and repeat the very experiment that destroyed him. Tutankhamun's death should have been a warning. His deformed bones, his failed offspring, the trail of twisted bodies buried in royal tombs. all signs that the divine bloodline had turned poisonous. But power, like genetics, tends to repeat itself. And so, centuries after Tutankhamun's tomb was sealed, a new dynasty arrived and resurrected the very curse that killed him. In 332 BCE, Alexander the Great conquered Egypt. When he died, one of his generals, Ptolemy, took control of the land of the pharaohs. But ruling Egypt wasn't just about power, it was about image. The Egyptians expected divine kings. So the new rulers studied the old ones and copied their worst ideas. Ptolemy married his sister, so did his son, and his grandson. Generation after generation, the Greek rulers of Egypt, now calling themselves pharaohs, turned their bloodline into a closed loop, marrying siblings to preserve royal purity. For nearly 300 years, the Ptolemaic dynasty became the most extreme experiment in royal inbreeding the ancient world had ever seen. By the time Cleopatra VII was born in 69 BCE, her family tree was a tangled web of cousins, siblings, and half-relatives marrying one another over and over. The same names, Ptolemy, Arsinoe, Berenice, repeated endlessly. A single drop of foreign blood was viewed as a threat. The physical toll was hidden beneath royal propaganda. Portraits idealized the rulers, coins were flattering, but historians suspect the truth was far darker. Cleopatra's famed beauty may have been a myth born of politics, not appearance. After 250 years of inbreeding, it's likely she bore the same markers of genetic decline: prominent jawlines, fertility problems, potential deformities. But Cleopatra had something many of her ancestors lacked: intellect. She spoke 9 languages, mastered politics, and understood science. Her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony weren't just alliances, they were attempts to break the genetic loop. Her children, born of Roman fathers, were her hope for salvation. But Rome had no interest in saving Egypt's bloodline. After Cleopatra's defeat, Octavian, the future Augustus, eliminated her heirs. The children she hoped would restore strength to her dynasty were either killed or vanished into history. When Cleopatra chose suicide, famously by snakebite, she ended not just her reign, but a centuries-long cycle of self-destruction. Egypt's last queen was also its final genetic experiment. The foreign rulers had conquered Egypt, but in the end, Egypt conquered them, through ideas, through religion, and through the seductive lie of divine blood. Across 3,000 years, Egyptian history repeated the same mistake, confusing purity with strength, tradition with truth, divinity with destiny. Each powerful dynasty, whether native or foreign, eventually turned inward, isolating its bloodline until it collapsed under the weight of its own myth. The bones buried in the Valley of the Kings, the tiny mummies entombed with their parents, the elongated skulls carved into temple walls, they all tell the same story. And modern science, through DNA and bone scans, has confirmed it. The pharaohs wanted to be remembered as gods. They are remembered instead as the greatest cautionary tale in the history of human genetics. Their legacy isn't gold or power. It's the lesson they left behind. In the end, no blood is too sacred to destroy itself.